lot of the magic at Penrose Studios happens from the cross-pollination of creative and technical talent.
The most frustrating thing about working in this medium is not having the appropriate tools. VR is a new medium, and there aren't a lot of things specifically built for VR creation.
Maestro is a tool that allows the Penrose team to collaborate inside a fully virtual space.
My life before Maestro was pretty much everybody on my back here trying to watch like a little screen, and sometimes it was like just too dark and people couldn't see, and everybody was just like crawling on top of my screen to try to see something.
Building Maestro was a really interesting experience. It was truly the synthesis of working with both the creative and engineering teams really, really effectively. As we were doing reviews in VR with the whole team in there, we would come up with new features and then test it out the next day.
Using the Penrose tool suite is my lifesaver. I don't think I would have been able to do any of the sequences without them.
It turns out it's a very natural, collaborative workflow that just doesn't feel odd at all. It just feels like, why have we not been doing this the whole time?
I'm really proud of our engineering team because we have people who are both really strong technically and who can collaborate really well with artists, who know how to speak to artists in a non-technical way about things that are extremely technical. As a result, we're able to build things that are really amazing.
I realized that I could just like roll my chair to the side and poke the engineers, and they would just like come up with such brilliant ideas.
I think that what's going to drive the next wave of human engagement inside of virtual and augmented reality is social collaboration and social connection.
With social VR, it doesn't matter where you are. You can be 1,000 miles away, anywhere in the world, and you can still collaborate together.
If I was to quantify the gains of Maestro, it's an exponential increase in our ability to execute on our goals.
Very excited to be here, working with the incredible team at Penrose Studios to help define that next generation of human storytelling.
All right. Well, big round of applause for Patrick and Lonnie, who not only developed this event, but helped develop that script. So Patrick and Lonnie, as always, thank you very much. I think it's a great pleasure that we've got two of our friends up here with us. My name's Bill Malloy. I'm one of the founding general partners here at Sway Ventures. Brian Nugent on the corner is my co-founder. Brian, you want to just start off and talk a little bit about Sway Ventures?
Yeah, sure. For those of you that don't know us, we're a San Francisco-based venture capital firm. We're generally early to medium growth, doing Series A and B financings. We do predominantly software, both enterprise and consumer. Occasionally we'll dabble on the hardware side of things. And virtual reality was an area we had an active thesis and still do. And tonight you'll learn a lot more about Penrose as well as Lytro. These are two really fascinating companies in the space, but we're glad you guys are taking an hour or two out of your week to come spend it with us.
Yeah. So I always love telling the story about how Eugene and I got to know each other. He was leaving Oculus. I was fortunate enough to be involved on a personal basis there early on. And I counted it. We had 33 meetings, 15 dinners, and about 100 phone calls. And then I finally convinced him to let's lead his seed round. So it's a very long process. Jason, on the other hand, we got to know each other through this event. And he said, as long as Lonnie creates a piece of unique art for him, he'll let me in last round's valuation, so it's a done deal already. So Eugene, will you start off and maybe give us a little bit about your background and Penrose?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. So Penrose Studios, we are a virtual and augmented reality company based here in San Francisco. Our mission is to define the next generation of human storytelling. We have this vision that we can create next generation media company powered by technology with this opportunity set that we haven't seen since the advent of the moving picture 120 plus years ago. My own background, and those of the team, often comes from places of both creative and technical background. So we have a lot of incredible world-class engineers paired with world-class creatives. And oftentimes those people are the same person, people with both left and right brain. My background before, I was early on, I've been coding and hacking since I was very young. And on the other side, I've been working in the film industry. So I worked at places like Pixar, and made movies the normal way. And this duality goes back to my parents because my mother is an accountant and my father is an opera singer. So I've always had this sort of duality from the very beginnings of my life. But growing up in Virginia in the suburbs, I noticed a very interesting thing, and that was that people didn't really watch opera. The neighborhood kids would play video games, or they'd watch movies, or they would go and watch television. But it was very strange to me because my dad would sing opera. So I looked back at the history books. I learned opera was this big major art form 150 years ago. And everyone thought, had the best characters, the best sound, the best music, and the best stories. And how could anything ever get beyond this? And of course, a little bit later in the 1890s, the first video cameras came around, and that created the first moving pictures. And now, 120 years later, those are all the names that we remember are the major movie companies, like the names like Disney, Fox, and Paramount. But we don't remember the names of the companies that were the big media companies of the 1890s and of their day. And so, of course, I found this to be really interesting, and I thought I'd never live to see the day we'd see the next transformation. We've had, stage plays for thousands of years, opera for hundreds of years, cinema for 120 years. I was lucky enough to get involved in virtual reality when it emerged a few years ago. Got involved early on with a company called Oculus, which was later acquired by Facebook, doing hardware. And I was doing content there, co-founded a thing called Oculus Story Studio, and created stories in virtual reality, starting the way. About 2 years ago, we created Penrose, a bunch of veterans from Oculus, DreamWorks, and Pixar, and here we are today in San Francisco, creating what we love, along with some great other pioneers. So, yeah.
So Jason, if you wouldn't mind, maybe do the same. You've had a really successful career prior to Lytro. You've raised a small amount of money, $200-something million, right? So congratulations. But yeah, help the audience understand, how you got to what you're doing now and what you're doing.
Sure. So at Lytro, we're building what we think is going to be really the professional production pipeline for creating virtual reality content around both live action and animation. So if you completely agree with what Eugene said in terms of just the evolution of media and the emergence of virtual reality, and if you look at sort of every major media type from television to movies and video games, to really make the mediums deliver on the promise of what they had to offer, you needed a tool set that made it possible for artists to express their vision in the form of this media. And so that's what we're doing at Lytro based on something called light field technology. And light fields go back to, the origin of them goes back to the late 1800s, but a lot of the serious work started on them at Stanford in the mid 90s. And sort of the idea is that if you look at how we think of images and pictures today, it doesn't matter whether it's a still image or a movie or digital or film. When you go to capture that, you're only really capturing two properties of light. You're getting brightness and color. And what the light field aspires to do is capture all the additional facets of light that go into what we as humans sort of see as the real world. So the big part of light field that's new in imaging is that you get every single ray of light. You know the direction that ray of light's coming from. You know where it's going to. And it turns out that if you record all that information at high resolution and a high frame rate, you're able to, rather than just creating a flat 2D representation of the world, you can think of it as a full 3D volumetric reconstruction of everything that you see. And it turns out that way of capturing images, that way of producing content is very, very important for helping both virtual reality and augmented reality deliver on what we hope they'll be, right? Because you don't want to get into a VR headset and watch sort of just a flat or spherical representation of the world. You want to be truly immersed in what you're doing and seeing, and that's what we're working towards.
Could you guys maybe shed some light for our guests, in addition to the great technologies that you're developing inside your own companies? Maybe we'll start with you, Eugene. What's happening in virtual and augmented reality? Just where are we in the evolution of development of technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's interesting because virtual and augmented reality are often paired together, but in many ways they're very different, both in the act of creation, but also some of the technology that goes around it. Virtual reality has had a bit more of a lead time. It's of course been around for decades, and it's had its peaks and its valleys, just like machine learning and artificial intelligence has had its peaks and valleys over decades. But this, of course, latest incarnation came around with the fall 2012 Oculus Kickstarter, and that's really been what's leading the way for the last several years. And so we had several years of VR development. But at the same time, we don't have a whole lot of VR headsets out there in households yet, right? And sort of the, if you count premium headsets, maybe getting to the double-digit millions, but you don't, you don't have like this vast proliferation. AR, we had always thought about as being sort of behind virtual reality, but with the launch of things like mobile phone-based AR, things like what Android announced recently, as well as, of course, the Apple AR Kit, which they announced in June, that means that at least phone-based AR is going to come to the vast majority of the masses very quickly. And that could lead to an acceleration of demand for the kinds of products and the kinds of technologies that we're creating. So it's kind of interesting because you're getting a point where VR is going ahead and then AR is sort of leapfrogging it. We're still a ways away from this sort of seamless device that can do augmented reality, virtual reality, and everything all together. But that will be the holy grail device that we're all looking forward to.
You want me to answer? Yeah. So I tend to think of it as, what we've seen throughout the history of technology is just different waves of computing. Starting with mainframe, mini, PC, client server, web, most recently mobile. And I think that what you're seeing generally with VR and AR is this is the first wave of immersive computing, right? So the fact that that throughout the history of computing, we've consumed all of our information, looking at these two-dimensional rectangles, first in the form of CRTs, and then more recently in the form of LCDs and OLED displays. The fact that we consume information that way is purely an artifact of sort of the lack of three-dimensional display technology. And so, if you think about it, we live our lives in 3D, right? Where we see things spatially, we reach out and touch things and grab things. So it's sort of intuitively obvious that if you could interact with your computer in that way, that's just a much, much better way to consume, create, manipulate information. And so we're really finally starting to see that happen. I think in terms of where we are in the journey, if you asked a bunch of us, maybe 2-3 years ago, I think people might have said, the first wave of the first version of the Oculus or the first Vive, like that's going to be like the iPhone 1, and then it's going to move super quickly from there, and then in 2 years will be like the iPhone 4, and there'll be billions of devices. I think that that sort of way overestimated the time and the work required to do that. So I would say we're sort of like somewhere between the first Mac circa 1994 and then maybe the dawn of the, if you remember, the Motorola StarTAC, which was sort of like the first really popular flip phone. It was a cell phone. It fit in your pocket. Like the battery lasted most of the day. Like we're somewhere in that evolution, but things are starting to move really, really fast.
Yep. I think you both have a similar story, although they're different with the businesses. How did the two of you meet?
So. Yes, I mean, I totally remember meeting Eugene in the when he was working at Oculus, and at the time, Lytro was we were doing light field technology, but we were trying to apply it to building consumer cameras, essentially using the same tech. And I saw Eugene in the hallway of one of our common investors, Andreessen Horowitz. He was lugging around this like gigantic server with like all these wires and stuff coming out of it, in a really early Oculus prototype, and we chatted in the hallway, and he's like, like light field might be really important for virtual reality, and that comment stuck with us. And we, a couple years later, we ended up really pivoting the company to focus on what we're doing now. Yeah. So you get all the credit, or the blame, depending on how this all works out.
I think it's interesting your guys' background. Greg brushed on it quickly, but you both are in this left brain, right brain background, that you both have some professional financial investment experience, and you both have this kind of right brain existence. You and I both have been to film school and both did venture capital. I'm still doing it. But so I get the question all the time, because there was a slide up here that we showed earlier that you guys had something exhibit at Cannes, in competition. Years ago, I co-produced a feature film that was exhibited there. And so people ask me, like, well, how do you reconcile these two worlds of like investing in stuff professionally, but also this right brain existence? You guys have both done it in spades. How do you, starting with you, Josh, like, when you wake up in the morning, do you think of yourself as an artist or like a business guy or?
Yeah, I think you can't differentiate. I mean, I think the way that we talk about Lytro is in general to all of our employees and customers is we're doing basically science for technology for art. So we're inventing new science so that we can turn it into technology that then artists can use to create and realize their visions. And that's I spent a lot of my career in enterprise software and the like, and I mean that's great, and you can build big exciting businesses, but there's something just incredibly exciting and energizing around trying to help artists tell their stories better and realize their creative vision. So that philosophy is a big part of what gets me excited to go into work every day.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think it depends entirely on one's approach to the different aspects. I mean, I think investing can be, not always, but can be an incredibly creative profession. I still remember one of my, when I was in private equity, one of my first pieces of advice was, my boss came to me and said, Eugene, there are several different types of investors. There's one investor that says, here are a bunch of champagne glass. Here's 100 champagne glasses, and they can pick the one right champagne glass. The second investor is, here's 100 champagne glasses. Now I can go make 1,000 out of those. And then the third type is, here's a champagne glass, but it's not really a champagne glass, it's a swan. And that always stuck with me. And it was interesting because as I went through my career, I saw the different types of those types of people. And actually at places like Warburg Pincus, we did some really interesting, just creative stuff. Like, for example, taking Brazilian trees and figuring out a way to, how would biomass potentially replace coal as a source of clean power, and whether that was a good thing or a bad thing for the environment, like some things that we would talk about. So yeah, there was a lot of that, and I've always found that be true in my career, both analytical as well as creative being combined.
So we'll switch the conversation to kind of the landscape as the two of you see it, and I'll kind of ask two questions. Jason, you get the first one is, what's your view? You are a hardware software company, so what's your view of the major players within VR and AR from a hardware standpoint, and kind of how does the landscape look from your standpoint?
Yes, I mean most of the investment in companies in VR have been in one of two places so far, either creating consumer devices, so Oculus and Vive and the new headsets from Microsoft and the new standalone headsets from Google and many others, or in creating companies, and Penrose is an example of this, around creating experiences and content for the new medium. I think that the first category of consumer devices is very, very, very hard for startups to do because it's it's so hit driven. It requires a huge amount of capital. I think that even Oculus, which has been hugely successful, like had they not been acquired by Facebook, it would have been really, really difficult for them to do even what they've done so far, and that journey is nowhere near done.
Eugene, software. What's the landscape look like? I mean, obviously Penrose fits into that, but can you talk to us about the infrastructure and some of the other companies that are in the software landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's interesting about software is that because we're in the early phases of an industry, we have to create a lot of the tools just ourselves, right? So we don't live in a world where you have modular architectures, where you have interchangeable parts because there are clean interfaces between different parts of the value chain. So what we instead have to do, like most early stage industries, is go create an architecture that's interdependent, meaning that if you want to go and create content, you often have to create the tech tool stack behind it, as well as work with other companies or work with some of the existing hardware and other things to try to integrate that. So that's some of the things we're finding, but we are finding that there is rapid modularization, right? There's things like Unity and Unreal Engine being sort of two very large engines that have really taken the lead. I mean, there are other engines out there that have products like CryEngine and other things, but those tend to be in the minority. So I'd say that those things are sort of starting to establish things on the software side. There's also other tools chains and other sort of use case devices like Quill that Oculus Story Studio created and other things. It's interesting what Lytro is doing is combining software and hardware as sort of in this interdependent chain, doing a lot of parts of the value chain to go and create these amazing, these really, really, truly amazing, if you guys haven't seen Hallelujah in the back, some really amazing light field enabled technology and content in VR. So I think that we're going to see how it progresses, but I do think interdependent architectures will be very valuable in the early phases of an industry, and then later on, of course, we're going to see modularization, as we are seeing even now, which is interesting to see.
Kind of along the lines of Bill's question, as you think about the business model, for the content and media industry in general, and how that ripples into what you guys are doing, you talked about the studio system. 100 years ago. It's kind of a return to form, because 100 years ago, the studios actually owned and operated theaters. Exhibition was vertically integrated, and then they sort of broke it up. You got into antitrust types of situations. But if you think about what Amazon and Netflix in particular are doing, and others will follow, is they're flattening out the distribution model again, where we're kind of back, to where we started, where if you look at Netflix's production slate and the budget they have, it absolutely dwarfs any of the traditional, Hollywood studios. So in your own business models, how does that flattening out and that new sort of business orientation impact your worldview of the business?
I can take that. So I mean, I think that's a phenomenal development, right? So I think if you were to look at the media industry through the lens of the technology industry, the sort of studio system that we've had for the last 100 years is basically like if there were only 6 venture capital firms that any entrepreneur could ever raise money from, and if you got told no by one of them, you were almost certainly going to get told no by the other one, because the only people that worked at any of those 6 companies were people who had previously worked at one of the other 6 companies. And so now what's happening with sort of huge content investments by Amazon and Netflix for sure, but also Hulu and increasingly Facebook, and Apple. It was in the news today that Apple may be bidding for the distribution rights for the next set of James Bond movies. I think we're going to see, and you're already seeing this sort of in the quality of TV that you can watch now, just like a huge increase in quality and breadth of content in ways that you can watch it. And I think we see it very much now in mobile devices and streaming services, but that for sure is going to ripple over to virtual reality as we start to see broader and broader penetration of consumer VR devices. So I think it's awesome.
And I would definitely agree. I mean, I think it's interesting because, if you kind of look in the past, what's amazing about sort of some media types of media businesses, there's great economies of scale. And you saw this in the early phases in the 1900s when the film industry was emerging. Europe actually had the lead over Hollywood, right? A lot of people forget this fact. And the European films were doing really well, and they were making the most money. And then, of course, in around 1914, 15, a big war broke out in Europe, and Hollywood started taking the lead. And a few years later, by the time we got to the 1920s, because Europe had not really developed, there was no progression in their film industry, and Hollywood had gotten this great economy of scale. They were able then to take those movies and then ship them out to the world, and they never looked back, right? Europe never regained its position, and Hollywood just went on. And that's because of the 5-year gap that allowed Hollywood to achieve that inflection point in scale. And of course, when you have entertainment products, economy of scale works incredibly well. And that's what we're going to see with hopefully some more of these proliferation of devices in the coming years with AR, VR, with things like ARKit and Android and other things, as well as, of course, the core VR growth. I think the interesting thing with business models is just like the early film pioneers, we have to invent new business models. So when you think of the early film people, they had to be 3 things. They had to be creative to create films. They had to be technologists to figure out how to work, these cameras and other things. And number 3, they had to be business model innovators, right? So instead of putting, the 45-second long films on a stage, with a big opera where everyone was dressed up in bow ties, they actually put them in Nickelodeons, right? They put little coins in and they, put a wheel around. And that started to lay the foundations for a new type of business. I think we have to do something similar here. It's hard to replicate the Netflix model because when Netflix, what they did was in 1999, they spent about $4 million of content and they arbitraged about 100 plus years of, amazing content and a library of that. And they're able to go do that. And then, now, of course, a few decades later, they're now spending in the billions, right? So that arbitrage opportunity has gone away, but they've used that capital to go and develop their own content business. I think for us, it's hard to create the Netflix of VR when there's not a lot of content, not a library of content. But we do have to do new things to say what is the right thing for our type of content and the things that we're creating. And it's very exciting to kind of be in this industry, being able to try and go do that.
reminds me of a board meeting we had a while back, and somebody asked the question, how do we charge for this content? And everybody looked at each other. No idea.
Finger in the wind. Well, if we can get a few microphones ready, we've got a ton of more questions from our end, but kind of prep the audience. We got a lot of our friends in the audience, a lot of founders, and I think a lot of people that are passionate about this industry. What can people in the audience do to kind of push this forward, whether it's from a VR standpoint, or AR standpoint, or just from the industry landscape in general? Jason, I'll let you chime in on that.
How many people have tried some form of VR? It's like good. You guys are way ahead of the the global curve, so that's really good. No, I think that I think the most important things is like if you saw something you like, tell your friends about it and encourage them to see it, and I think the rest is going to just take care of itself.
Well,
anything more than a head nod there?
I think the interesting thing is I get this question a lot from people, and the thing I say is right now it's so early. Like go and create. Right, there's a lot of resources out there, and there's not a lot of people. There's not a lot of people making a whole lot of VR content, right? It's not like an established industry like the video game industry or the film industry or other things. You can go pick up, a quick, either even just a 360 camera or pick up Unity or Unreal, and you can very quickly start and go and create stuff. And I think you learn so much from just doing. And with this profession, there is no manual, there is no, school you can really go to. So just by going and doing and picking that up, you will learn a whole lot, and you'll meet a whole lot of fun and great people along the way. So I think we're in that phase of that industry. So that would be my continued advice.
Maybe take a few questions from the audience. Go ahead, Greg. You're the.
So we're all talking about AR. It's coming. Everybody's going to get it before they get a VR headset, probably. Are you developing or thinking about developing content for AR at Penrose?
Yeah. So we purposely haven't put the word VR in our name. When we were founded 2 years ago, everyone was very hyped up on virtual reality, but we actually, on our website, even had augmented and virtual reality creators. Because for us, it's been about the idea that mixed reality, augmented reality, virtual reality are all these different art forms. And of course, things like the HoloLens came out last year for developers. And we've been creating since day one for augmented reality. We've yet to release a product yet, but that's mostly because augmented reality products haven't been released to the public, right? Even the developer edition is what we have of the HoloLens. Once we do, though, we've made plenty of things internally. At Penrose, we've created many things that we haven't necessarily released because either they haven't achieved our quality bar. One of our key principles and core principles, and big kudos to Bill and Brian for really pushing that home for us on pushing forward on values and some of our key values. But one of them is quality and excellence. So for part of the time, some of the AR products haven't achieved that, and so we haven't released it. But the other thing is there's no actual entertainment or consumer product out there to release. So once they do, we'll see what happens. But we're definitely excited about it. What's that?
I'm excited for it.
I think we all are, right?
All right, thanks for doing this. So my question is, I'm curious what you guys see as some of the biggest hurdles facing storytelling in VR, AR, whether it's conceptually working for the new medium, whether it's technological, whether it's a user-based numbers issue, or like, what do you see as like some of the big issues, hurdles to face?
I'll actually take a step of that, and then maybe I'll let you answer it. Eugene and I talk a lot about this from a hurdle standpoint. I think the sector in general had a lot of wind behind it, and you actually saw this. We were making the comparison to the telecom industry. It's like, a part of it is you have the analyst reports. If you trace it back to the telecom industry, it's very, very similar. It's like projections go like this. Well, what actually happens, in every projection that goes like that, it probably doesn't, right? It's more bumpy, and then maybe get a spike and it comes down. So I think there are a lot of these projections that just set a lot of false expectations. And from a market win standpoint, I think those expectations weren't a reality in the first place, so they shouldn't have been set. So I think we're still dealing with that just as a founder community and investor community. And I think it'll self-correct, right? As we start to see things that happen within augmented reality and more penetration within virtual reality, I think it'll self-correct. But I think you saw the exact same thing in the telecom industry.
I think that's a really good point. I think that also, as Eugene touched on, like the whole way that you tell a story, the whole way that you create a experience needs to be pretty fundamentally reinvented to be done well in VR and AR. And if you think of movies, right? I mean, the sort of form for what a movie was, which is like a series of rectangles that come at you on a screen, like that format was set over 100 years ago, and we've now had 100 years of iteration and improvement around how you tell a story in that format. We're like 2 years into VR in doing that, so there's a lot more experimentation and thinking and trial and error that has to be done before we get to sort of the breakthrough experience there.
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. So my question is, what are any one of you's personal vision of the best possible outcome if, let's say, the whole of America and China has casual access to VR whenever they want and however they want?
So I think the way I think that I mean there are lots of really easy to see things in terms of like new forms of training and education and entertainment experiences. But I think that the best thing that probably living in San Francisco and Silicon Valley that we don't think about enough is that the real promise of VR is that imagine all the experiences that we're able to have as like first world rich people, and then the billions of people who can't have those experiences, from whether it's like visiting the Louvre or meeting people from other countries or just sort of global experiences that require you to have money and time and be able to travel. If VR sort of realizes even a portion of its potential, you should be able to easily and affordably offer those experiences to billions of people who can't get that today.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I mean, I think with all technologies, it's all about the way we utilize it. And I think there's so much power. I mean, I've experienced a lot of VR, and some of it has been, I'm very sensitive to VR, so sometimes I get sick and other things. But when you see some really powerful VR, something that's empathetic or something that gets you to understand something that you didn't understand before, it's more powerful than any other sort of visual medium that's existed. And that's something that that have stayed with me since the foundation of this industry. And I'm really excited for other people around the world to be able to go experience that. And I think we started off, we're progressing, especially with live action stuff. It started off with 360 video, but I think the thing we said when I was at Andreessen Horowitz was like light field capture is going to be the thing that allows us to really feel like we're in this space, to walk around and see, like behind someone's head and feel like we're there. 6 Degrees of Freedom, that moment of positional tracking, the first moment I felt presence was something where I was like, it was so magical. I cannot wait for all of America, all of China, and the entire world to be able to experience the power of presence and the magic of it.
Okay, I had a question. Oh, hello, I'm Charles. And I put a lot of people in VR, and a lot of times when they sit through these movies, sometimes their attention, they're new, so they're looking around, so they don't actually see the movie. They don't actually see what you intend to actually display. So you put a lot of work into crafting these stories. How do you ensure, or what are you doing to make sure that people actually see them and not just get amazed by what's around them?
It's a great question. So for us, I mean, technically speaking, even with the flat screen, you could in theory just kind of look behind you and not actually look at it. I think we actually have a lot of things we draw from theater and opera, right? Light cues, movement cues, sound cues, and those allow us to go look left, look right, et cetera. And we've now done thousands upon thousands of demos. My colleague Mary, sitting in the second row here, has probably done thousands more than I have. But I can say that after having done those, first-time viewers usually watch like Allumette or Arden's Wake in basically the same way. And that's because hopefully we've done our jobs, and this through lots of iteration. And there's a story point here, there's a story point there, and we use the guiding cues of sound and other things to make sure that they do that. And I gotta say, after having seen thousands, basically everyone kind of sees it. They might be looking at slightly different angles, but they're not like wandering over on that side of the town.
Yeah, we're talking a lot about the medium of how storytelling's changed, but what about storytelling itself? So what do you think, will this medium change what a story is or what a story means in terms of like humans?
So, the way I think about it, and I mean, it's a good discussion topic, but you sort of have the way that VR exists today is that you've got sort of mostly cinematic things over here that are sort of like new versions of movies, and then you have like heavily interactive things that are more game-like. And I think that the sort of the best version of VR that is yet to emerge will be figuring out how to fuse the best elements of games and movies or interactive versus cinematic things into something that I think is going to be fundamentally new. And to do that really, really well, it's going to involve all kinds of AI-oriented stuff, a bunch of speech recognition stuff, so that you can really deliver on this notion of presence and making people feel like they're immersed in something that doesn't fundamentally exist. But I don't think we've seen it yet.
All right, I think the question, we have a drone pilot.
Perfect.
I want to see what the drone pilot.
Hi. Perfect. My question is, Eugene, you said that you are focused on two things based on what I understood, like creating like a virtual space, but also the film industry, right? So my question is, aren't you focused on just one? And if you are in the creating the virtual space, what's the difference with what Facebook is trying to do? And in terms of the storytelling one, I always had this doubt because I talked to Google Spotlight Stories, and I know they have unlimited funding from Google, right? Like to be creating the films. But the problem is the distribution, that it's not like this traditional regular cinema industry where everyone can go see the movie. So you can't monetize it. And well, VCs want to see a return, right? So we were talking, what if we just build like a mini cinemas everywhere? And he said that may help. But I don't know. I would like to know what are your thoughts about it.
Yeah, sure. And the last part was a mini scene, you said? Oh, okay. Oh, like location-based entertainment type stuff. Okay. Yeah. So, So maybe addressing the LBE opportunity. It's interesting. We actually, as you all know, we kind of did a exercise where we kind of looked at the ROI, and frankly, with our cost of capital, we didn't think it looked very good, especially with San Francisco real estate. So, we got IRRs, and we were looking at IRRs that were kind of like field level IRRs in the 5 to 10%, which was kind of okay for certain kinds of capital, but we probably want to like get a different sort of financing structure to go do that. I think that with a lot of assumptions, right? How much are you charging per minute, et cetera? I think in certain places, right? If you have like a high foot traffic, like in Times Square, where the Void is doing their first experiment, and they're charging incredibly high ASPs or average selling prices, I think that those economics can work. Eventually, I think in the early days, LBE is definitely a place where you're seeing a lot of monetization in places like China and places like some places in the US. But I think if virtual reality does its job, we're not going to need to have to go anywhere. So that's going to be the whole purpose of it. So we actually had that sort of existential talk even internally, right? Is this something that we want to pursue? Is it something not? We ultimately decided not at least to do it internally, but there's certainly a lot of conversations with people who are operating LBE franchises, who some of our business development team and contacts are looking into. So that's, so I think it's a good near-term opportunity, but in the long term, we think that it's going to be all about your own personal device, and that's where it's going to go.
One more question from the audience, and then Brian, I'll hand over to you.
So I have two related concerns for VR. I've tried it a couple of times, and it's been really magical and amazing. But two things have come up for me. One is I found afterwards, you mentioned feeling sick sometimes. I found that I feel weirdly like drunk and disassociated from reality afterwards. And I'm curious if that's, I'm just like a sailor that hasn't got to sea legs, or if I'm watching low quality junk and high quality stuff doesn't work, or if this is a fundamental technological challenge that needs to still be overcome. And then the second is, in watching of movies, television, one of my favorite parts about it is the social element of it, of getting together for Game of Thrones, or I think maybe my first kiss was in a movie theater, and things like that. And it feels to me like VR is perhaps lost. And is that, again, a kind of a temporary phenomenon, or do you see a solution to that?
Sure. I mean, I can address a few things quickly. I think the loneliness thing is interesting. I think we think that certainly, as you saw in the intro, actually our team spends hours every day in VR. together. And it doesn't matter whether we're next to each other or we're 2,500 miles away in New York, we can, kind of operate as if we're working in the same virtual space. That makes it feel a lot less lonely. It's kind of actually incredible when you hear your colleagues sort of, talking to you in your ear. In some ways, it's even more intimate because you hear their voice like right there, and it's in a sort of timbre that you're really used to. So it's a pretty social experience in a way. And as technology gets better, as light field technology gets better, we could feel like we're really, really right there. Right now, we have very simple avatars, as you saw. So I think that's right. And then in terms of quality of experience, I have no idea what things you've seen, but I think when you have good 6 degrees of freedom, positional tracked VR that delivers presence, which is really VR magic, there's nothing quite like it. I mean, I get sick from things that move you around in weird ways and other things, and I'm very sensitive to that kind of stuff. So we are very careful not to create things that do that. But I think it's all about both the technology that getting better and better on the hardware side, and of course the way you use that technology.
Well said.
All right, Brian, over to you. We'll ask a few more questions, and then we'll let everybody eat more food and drink more wine.
I have a somewhat cynical response, which is we hooked Eugene up with Jim Cameron's team down in LA, and he went down and gave him a demo, and they loved it because he announced 4 sequels for Avatar, right? It's like, wow, that's a lot of content to generate, and part of what they're cogitating on is, do you graduate from 3D to, VR, right? Not necessarily to replace the theater experience, but to augment it as a business model. Because after the last Avatar was theatrically released, there was a subset of people that was measured in many, many, many millions of people around the world who would go back and see it. Part of the reason it did $2 billion in box office is because you had repeat offenders that would see it 8, 10 times, kind of like Star Wars was. But ticket prices changed, 35 years later. So we're not laughing, we're laughing with people that they were actually, like, the prescriptions for Xanax and Prozac went off the charts because people couldn't revisit the world of Pandora. I'm not making this up. People literally couldn't function in their daily lives because what they saw on Pandora through the eyes of Jim Cameron and a lot of technology was like, well, shit, I want to live there. So I'm not saying that's you, but that's part of the issue people have is when they go to these worlds, it's so real and it's so compelling that they're kind of like, wow, my normal life isn't quite as interesting.
So Jason, question for you on the funding environment. I think the stats, virtual reality for this year has really outpaced augmented reality. And I can't predict the future, but I'm going to ask you to. What's your view from a funding standpoint? We've got founders that maybe are in the audience, looking for capital. Do you think that percentage with virtual reality outpacing augmented reality stays the same this year, the next 3 to 5 years, or how does it play out in your mind?
I mean, I think from a capital raising perspective, when I'd put it back on the investors, which is I'd say, look, I think smart investors should be deploying capital now in both VR and AR. We're finally, where enough of the ecosystem is starting to click, where I think you can build some really substantial companies, and you want to get started now before the horse is out of the barn. I think we're about to enter sort of peak AR hype as we see the announcement of the iPhone 8 next week, as Google starts to ship AR Core in every Android phone. So there's going to be the same excitement that we saw about VR 2-ish years ago. That's now going to all happen around AR, and we'll have the same sort of inevitable period of disappointment after it turns out to not be quite ready.
Yep. Agreed. All right. Well, thanks to our panel, Jason, and thank you all for coming. I'll be here.